Senator, before you get up here, we've taken care of all the important business. We prayed and had the pledge. So that's what we do here in Madison County. We're so happy to have you, and we also know you carried this state in 2012. So you're not a stranger here. Some of you here, including Pastor Carter, saw you at, is it Birth Choice?
Yeah, Christ Springs.
At Northside Assemblies. And in fact, I was there, and I know many of my friends were there. And we're so honored and happy to have you here. We appreciate you because you're a man of faith and you love the country. So come on up here, and we welcome you to Madison County, Jackson, Tennessee.
Well, thank you very much. It is great to be back here. Thank you so much for coming out today and joining me. And it's great to be back here in Madison County and Jackson. I remember very fondly a packed church, if I recall, that I had a chance to speak to, and shared a little bit of my testimony and shared about how important the issue of life is to me. And I'm just happy to be back in God's country, in a wonderful place here. Thank you, the owners, for the hospitality and creating the opportunity for us to be here. Let me apologize for being late. Plane was a little late, and then just a long way from Nashville Airport to here. I ran into a couple of storms on the way, but I'm here, and because I'm running late, I'll limit my remarks, because I really, when I do events like this, I really want to hear from people, and want to hear what your questions are, what your concerns are. One of the things when I talk to the press all the time, they say, well, what are people concerned about? And I don't know how most politicians know, because most politicians just talk all the time and don't listen to anybody. And so when I have a town hall meeting, I like to listen to folks and get as many questions as I can answer. But just let me share sort of where I maybe what I think is the most important issue pressing us today. And I say today because today is 9/11. And today is a day that I remember very vividly, because I was in the United States Senate on 9/11, and a few days afterwards, I remember flying in a helicopter over Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the site where Flight 93 went down, and those images are just seared in my mind. And the greatest disappointment that I've had since the events of 9/11 is that we've had leaders in this country who have failed in one of the most fundamental things that leaders are supposed to do, and that's be honest with the American public about the nature of the threats that confront us. And right after the events of 9/11, I remember getting out of that Black Hawk helicopter, and after having flown above that crash site, and I remember repeatedly calling the pilot, because we were in a helicopter, we had our headphones on, and I kept saying, but where's the crash? Because you couldn't see it, there was nothing. It was just a hole, still smoldering 4 days later. And there was nothing. It was simply disintegrated, and it was just this little hole. Everything had vaporized in the impact. And I just, that image of how horrific that moment must have been continues even to this day to stay with me. And I think it's important that we tell the American public who these people were that caused this terrorist attack, and who they've become, what they've morphed into. And I would make the argument that President Bush did a reasonably good job in identifying the enemy. I think he could have been stronger personally. In fact, I gave a speech in 2005, and after I gave the speech at the National Press Club, suggesting to the president that we needed to better name our enemy and define who they were to the American public. And I actually went to the White House, a meeting shortly thereafter, a couple days later, and actually gave it to the president and said, Mr. President, you got to give this speech and do a better job of leading this country by describing who these people are and what they really believe in. Well, today we've seen Al-Qaeda morph into ISIS, and we've seen something that I talked about back after the events of 9/11, a nuclear Iran come to the fore. We were all concerned after 9/11 about Afghanistan and Iraq. I was introducing bills on Iran because I saw Iran as the greater threat, because I took time after 9/11 to study Islam, radical Islam, and the current versions of it, radical Shia and Sunni Islam. And it was very apparent to me way back 10, 12 years ago that Iran was the greatest future threat to our country. But both are dangerous, one short-term, ISIS, one long-term, Iran. I'll just give you a quick vision, at least, as to what the problem is with both of these religions and the leaders, and what we have to do to confront them, and then I'll open it up for questions. First, ISIS, because it's the short term. ISIS, as you know, is a radical version of Al-Qaeda. You thought Al-Qaeda was bad and the attacks of 9/11. But ISIS, if you watch the news, is even more horrific in what they do to people. It's like cancer. The best way I can describe it is like cancer. If any of you have ever had cancer, or if you know someone who has cancer and they have a tumor removed, or they have a process done, chemotherapy, and the cancer goes away, if it comes back, what usually is the case when it comes back? It's worse. And every iteration that comes back, it's more virulent until it kills you. That's pretty much what we're seeing. We saw the Muslim Brotherhood, and then Al-Qaeda, and then Hamas, and now you have ISIS, which is the most virulent of all. They are a group of people who want to conquer the world. I know that sounds ridiculous. They're just folks who now control an area the size of the state of Indiana. But they want to conquer the world, not because they want to have a power rush, not because they want to make a lot of money. They want to conquer the world because they believe that they are put on this earth to bring about the culmination of what Islam was here to do, which was to in fact conquer the world. And in this case, this group of people believes that they need to do so by causing a global war to bring about the end of times. Both ISIS and particularly Iran, I refer to as death cults. They believe that their mission is to bring about the return of their Savior and bring about the end of times in the world. ISIS concerns me because they're a very horrible, aggressive, radical group that is continuing to maintain their state, if you will, and by doing so, they can appeal to 85% of Muslims in the world who are Sunni Muslims, because these folks are Sunnis. They can appeal to 85% of the Muslims because they have established a new caliphate. Those of you who have not studied Islamic history, there was a caliphate for over 1,000 years that ended in 1924, not that long ago. But for 1,300 years, there was a Sunni caliphate that spread Islam all over the world, mostly by the sword. It went away after World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. It has now been reconstituted. Some people say, oh, it's an illegitimate caliphate, but it's there. Why? Because they control land, they control a state, and by doing so under Islamic law, they have the right to declare a caliphate and call other Muslims to join them, to join the jihad. So when you see these instances that you have seen here in America where these lone wolf attacks, they're not lone wolf attacks, they're following what ISIS is calling them to do. And more is going to happen. Why will more happen? As long as ISIS remains a caliphate, as long as they control that territory, as long as they look like they are defeating Iraq and the United States, more will join them. That's why the policy we have toward ISIS is so important. The president's policy right now toward ISIS is containment. That is a horrible policy because it legitimizes ISIS in the world, in the eyes of the Muslim world, that they are legitimate, that they are a state that needs to be followed. And if you read the Islamic texts, there is a duty to follow the caliphate. So our strategy is the wrong strategy. Why? Because we don't identify the reality of who they are. And therefore, we see them as just another group of folks that we just need to contain, and we can keep them in their area and they won't bother us, or they may cause havoc, as we've seen. The Syrian refugees, all the refugees, Obama's refugees from the war in Syria and the impact of ISIS in that region. It's going to affect us. We now are accepting 10,000 more refugees. It's not just going to be in that region. It will affect all of us. And not just with terrorism, but with also the outpouring of people who are trying to leave these barbarians in this region. But the longer and more serious threat is Iran. Iran is now on the path, thanks to the vote in the United States Senate yesterday, is on the path to getting a nuclear weapon, thanks to the President of the United States. The President of the United States has now put Iran on a legitimate path. Every nuclear operation that Iran had was against a one or more UN resolutions. Iran was under sanctions as a result of developing all of this capability. But thanks to President Obama and this agreement, now all of those facilities are now legal. They're all now not going to be sanctioned. They are going to be normalized. We're not shutting down any of those facilities. We're mothballing a few. We're changing purposes, but all of them will be there. And the ability to process uranium and to keep their military sites secret, all will be maintained. They will continue to be able to do in private, legally now, what they were doing illegally prior to this agreement. And who is this regime that we're giving this nuclear capability to? If you thought ISIS was bad, this is even a more virulent strain of Islam. This is Shia Islam, which is even more apocalyptic than Sunni Islam. They believe that their savior, the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, is going to return at a time of Armageddon, at a time of global war. And they believe, if you poll Sunnis, if you poll people in the Middle East, 73% of Iraqis who are Shia Muslims, like Iran, believe the end of the world is coming in their lifetime. 73%. That means we have given a nuclear weapon to a country that is a death cult that wants to bring about the end of the war. Who in their right mind would do something like that? What country would stand behind a president that does something like that? I'll tell you what country. A country that doesn't know what I just told you. A country that's not informed by Republican or Democratic leaders. And you say, well, how can Iran do something like that? I met with a former CIA director who told me that his greatest concern about Iran and a nuclear weapon is something called an electromagnetic pulse bomb. Anybody ever heard of something like that? Good for you. Most Americans have not. It's the ability to explode a nuclear weapon in the upper atmosphere to knock out everything that is powered by electricity in a continent. An exploded nuclear weapon above Iowa knocks out the entire electric grid of the United States of America, Mexico, and Canada, and puts us back into the 1890s. The problem is, in most of America, we can't live like we did in the 1890s. Because you don't have water in cities without electricity. You don't have food. Imagine the chaos. Well, we have imagined it. We had something called an EMP commission about 15 years ago that studied this issue and projected that within a year, 90% casualties in the United States of America. You say, well, that can't happen here. It can if someone has a nuclear weapon, puts it on a weather satellite, and explodes it above Iowa, all of which are technically very feasible to do. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious issue. And we're not having a serious discussion about the great threat that Iran is, about the immediate threat that ISIS is. People ask me, what would I do? I said, I would prevent a war. I would prevent a country that wants to bring about mass killings and mass destruction. Not just the destruction of the state of Israel, but far beyond that. I would stop them from having the ability to do this. You say, how would you do that? I would say on the first day I'm in office that the agreement that the president signed, since he refused to take it to the Congress and make it the law of the land, is the law of Obama, and Obama's gone. We have a new sheriff in town, and that means we have a new deal. Not that new deal, another new deal. This deal is, you open up every one of your facilities, you begin the process of shutting them down, you open them up to American inspectors, UN inspectors, and immediately begin the process of closing and dismantling those facilities. And if you don't do that, we will dismantle them for you. People have told, when I've said that, people say, well, you're going to start a war. No, I'm going to stop a war.
Israel took out a Syrian reactor when Syria was developing a nuclear capability, and did the same thing in Iraq. When Israel did that, did they start a war? No, they did not. They stopped a war. So that's what all of these folks running around like John Kerry pushing paper, thinking paper is going to stop someone from accomplishing what they are committed to accomplishing, what they say today they want to accomplish. They said 2 days ago they want to wipe Israel off the map, that Israel won't exist in 25 years. They talk about the United States being gone. We know what they want to do. We just pretend that they don't mean it. They mean it. And we're giving them the capability to do it. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the reasons I'm running for president is, unlike 4 years ago when I was here and traveling across the state of Tennessee, and thank you again for your support, national security was a non-issue. I talked about it, but very few. I talked about Iran 4 years ago. But 12 years ago, I authored a bill called the Iran Freedom and Support Act, which put many of the sanctions that are in place on Iran today. That was my bill 12 years ago. I have been on this hunt. I understand this enemy. 5 months ago, ISIS published a magazine. They publish an online magazine on pretty much a monthly basis. Well, 5 months ago, I was in ISIS magazine. My picture, under the headline, "In the words of our enemies, ISIS knows who I am." Next to the picture was a quote from me describing ISIS and why we had to defeat them. They know me, and I know them. And the same is true with Iran. I know there's a lot of people right now who are looking for someone new, a fresh face in Washington, someone who can shake things up. Here's what I would say to that. Commander-in-Chief is not an entry-level position. It is the most significant task a president has to do. And if we have a loose cannon or someone who doesn't understand what the enemy is all about and surrounds themselves because of their inexperience with the traditional people who advise presidents, and that's what you'll get, then what you're going to have is a continuation of the policies that has put our country in dire jeopardy. Ladies and gentlemen, let me assure you, one thing you can look at my record, which you can't on all these other folks. I say what I believe and I do what I say. I was introduced the other day in Iowa by an old colleague of mine, Chuck Grassley, who's been in Congress and Senate longer than I was. And he introduced me and he said, "I've known Rick Santorum for 20 years. And I can say one thing about him. He hasn't changed a bit. He's saying the same things now as he did 20 years ago, and I suspect he'll do the same thing if he's elected." Now, if that's what you're looking for, then I would appreciate your support, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Okay, questions?
I have one.
Yes?
What would you recommend the appropriate way, other than praying, for good people of faith to turn around the gay marriage ruling by the Supreme Court?
Obviously, prayer is obviously first and foremost. We may be the only campaign that actually has a prayer team and actually recruits people on our website to be part of our prayer team, because it is critically important. If you look at the situation in Kentucky and what's going on right there, I've referred to Kim Davis as someone who's heroic. Why is she heroic? Because she's standing up for what she believes in. And she's willing to suffer the consequences of a society that has put unjust laws on the books and has a Supreme Court that has acted unconstitutionally. I would argue as a district court judge that has acted beyond his authority to act. There's nothing in that Supreme Court decision that requires her to issue those licenses. Read the decision. It says very clearly, look, there's going to be a lot of issues here coming up, and we got to work on a way to accommodate people. They were saying, look, this is going to be a big change, and so we got to work our way through it. She didn't violate the Supreme Court ruling, which I believe is illegitimate. Just telling you right up. It's illegitimate because Justice Roberts, in his dissent, said it. He said, there is no constitutional basis for this decision. They simply made this up. The court's not allowed to make things up. The court's like every other branch of government. When it exceeds its constitutional authority, the other branches of government's job is to make sure that they don't do that. Anybody know what that's called in your civics books? Checks and balances. When the president exceeds its authority, you saw this decision just by a district court yesterday. The president's spending his money on Obamacare that the Congress says you can't spend. He went ahead and spent it anyway. The Congress sued, and they passed a resolution which authorized a suit to be brought, and it was. And yesterday, the district court in D.C. said the president was wrong. It said that Congress has standing to bring this suit because the president exceeded his authority. So here's a situation where the Congress and the court are trying to check a president who's acting unconstitutionally. That's how it's supposed to work. But there are people in our country who believe that when a court acts, well, everybody has to just, that's it. It's the highest law of the land. No, it's not. When the court acts unconstitutionally, then it's incumbent upon the Congress and the president. Well, you know what the president's going to do? Nothing. So the first thing I would say you should do is to encourage your Congress and senators to stand up to the court when they abuse their authority and try to pass something that says that this matter is not in the purview of the United States Supreme Court. It's not. They don't have the right to create new constitutional rights out of whole cloth, which is what they've done here. So that would be number one. Number two, I think what Kim Davis did in standing up for her constitutional rights is what more Americans need to do. We have to stop being told that just because 5 people say this is the law, when they do so and act unconstitutionally, then we have to stand up for our rights. And that means you may suffer consequences when, as this judge in Kentucky did, gets it wrong and put her in jail. I think that was a complete... We had the mayor of San Francisco was issuing marriage licenses after California said that marriage was between a man and a woman. He went out and issued marriage license. They throw him in jail? No, they didn't. No, they just threw her in jail. And it's an overreaction. And it's a persecution that is coming, ladies and gentlemen, unless we stand up and say that we are not going to tolerate it. You have 10,000 Kim Davises in jail across the country. Maybe Congress will and the president will say, well, maybe we got a problem here. Maybe this isn't what America really wants after all. But that's a decision that the American public has to make and members of Congress have to make, because the courts made their decision. The court gives an opinion, they make their decision, and you know what determines whether people pay attention, whether people treat that as the law of the land? You. And your members of Congress and the president. If everybody goes along with it, guess what? Then they win. If people say, no, we're not going to go along with this, this is against the natural law, this is against what's good for America, then you fight. And sometimes you fight by trying to get the Congress to change things. Sometimes you fight by standing up for your own religious liberties within your job or within your church or whatever. But people always ask me, as you just said, what should we do? And my answer, whatever the issue is when you're fighting the major changes that are going on in this country right now, my answer is do something. Just don't sit here and do nothing. Don't say, well, it's bigger than me. I can't, I'm one person. I'm here in, West Tennessee. What impact am I going to have? Well, look at what impact some county clerk in rural Kentucky had, because she did something. Now, you can argue right or wrong whether she broke the law or didn't break the law. I would say she didn't, because there's no law to break. It's just a court opinion that doesn't have anything to do with what she actually was deciding. There should be, at a minimum, accommodations made for people of faith, so we don't have people who have to violate one of the most important tenets of their faith in order to live here in America. That shouldn't be a requirement in this country. That's what the First Amendment is all about. That's where accommodation comes in. One of the bills that I've been an advocate of since this decision is a bill called the First Amendment Defense Act, which actually protects people like Kim Davis from having to do things that are against their religious principles and still be able to function in their job. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do in the short term. In the long term, we have to get this right. And let me assure you, ultimately, what is constitutional is what the American public say. Ultimately, that's what a republic is about. And whether it's this issue, whether it's the life issue, how do we get to the point where we have 55 million babies killed in America over the last 40 years? I hate to say it, is look in the mirror. We let it happen. So we just accepted it. We just said, oh, well, the court died. Sorry, I guess that's the way it is. No, no. For the last 50 years, there have been those who are trying to change the marriage laws in this country. And they failed. Did they give up? No. They kept fighting until they won. The interesting thing is when we have something that we know is true and good and right, and it's taken away from us, immediately the flag of surrender goes up. Oh, okay, well, we lost, time to move on. A majority of the Republican candidates for president have said after the court decision, that's the law of the land, it's time to move on. Really? We have a court that's exceeded its authority, acted unconstitutional. It's time to move on. We have an assault on the First Amendment like we have never seen in our country. Time to move on. We have an assault on the basic unit of society, the family. The United States Supreme Court, ladies and gentlemen, in that decision said, marriage has nothing to do with children. Think about that, folks. What's going to be the long-term impact of a society that says to young men and to young women, marriage has nothing to do with children? We're already at 40% of children being born out of wedlock. For the first time, and this has rapidly increased just in the last 7 or 8 years, we've seen an increase in the percentage of children born out of wedlock whose father of the child was living in the home. Not married, but living in the home. It used to be a very small percentage of children born out of wedlock where the father's actually living in the home. Now it's a majority. Why? Because marriage has nothing to do with children. You can have children and not get married. Why? Because marriage has nothing to do with children. That's been growing in society for a while. Now we've put the nail in the coffin and said, marriage is not about kids. What do you think the impact on children in America will be? Well, here's what you need to do. Look at the studies about children being raised in fatherless homes and see how well they do versus children raised in stable two-parent families. It's not that single moms don't do heroic work, but guess what? Unfortunately, doing a job for two people by one person is a lot harder, particularly in America today. And if you look at the numbers, they're not pleasant. There was a study done by a liberal Harvard professor named Robert Putnam, who said that if you're raised in a single-parent family, in a neighborhood of single-parent families, and you go to a school that's predominantly single-parent family kids, the chances of you ever reaching the top 20%, not top 5% or 1%, top 20% of income earners in America, the chance you'll ever do that as one of these kids is 3% in America. Is that good enough for you? Is that a country that allows upward mobility? And by the way, that 3%, it doesn't matter whether it's the color of your skin. You can be black, Hispanic, white. If you come from that family situation, that neighborhood, and that school, the numbers are the same. It has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. It has to do with family structure. And by the way, if you come from a two-parent family in a neighborhood of two-parent family and go to a two-parent family school, the chances of you succeeding in America are almost 100%. That's the reality. And we have now put ourselves in a position that we're going to put more and more children in that vulnerable position, and we're not doing a thing about it. You have very few politicians who will stand here in front of you running for president who will even talk about it. In fact, most of the Republicans I mentioned, 10 or 11 out of the 16, have said they won't talk about it. It's time to move on. It's time to move on when the American family's got a sledgehammer across the head. It's time to move on. It's time to move on when courts act unconstitutionally and we aren't going to stop it. It's time to move on when the First Amendment is under attack. Here's my question. Why are you running for president? If you're not willing to stand up for those basic things, why do you want to be president? At a time when America needs real leadership and vision. Yes, ma'am.
Since Washington appears to be very polarized and also in gridlock, are you willing to compromise in the best interest of this country to negotiate and compromise, to bring both sides together and really get something done?
I'll give you 2 points on this. Number one, let me define a good compromise and a bad compromise. And that's what people just say the word compromise. A lot of people think, oh, that's bad. Then other people hear the word compromise and say, oh, that's good. And it could be bad and it could be good. There are good compromises and bad compromises. I was in the Congress and the Senate for 16 years. And I negotiated some pretty good compromises. You know what a good compromise is? Doing less of a good thing. That's a good compromise. What's a bad compromise? Doing less of a bad thing. That's a bad compromise. If you get the other side, oh, well, we got them to do less of something that's harming this country, and that's a win. No, that's a loss, because it's harming the country. If you sit down with the other side and you have something that you think is going to be good for the country, and because you have to compromise, you get less of a good thing, that's still a good thing, and it's a good compromise. I use the example of welfare reform. Welfare reform, the good compromise was, we put more money in programs I didn't want to put money into. It was a lot more, it was more entitlement spending on a variety of different programs to support primarily single moms. You say, well, why did you do that? Well, because the bill ended welfare as a federal entitlement, block granted the money to the states, which now give the states the control over it instead of the federal government, put a work requirement for people who are on welfare, and put a time limit on welfare. So those things, to me, were more important than spending a little bit more money. And in the end, what happened, we actually spent a lot less money. Why? Because the welfare rolls were cut in half. People went back to work, poverty went down. So that was a good compromise to make. We had to negotiate 3 times. Bill Clinton vetoed that bill twice before he signed it. So that's a good compromise. And if you look at my record on welfare, on pro-life bills like partial birth abortion, and you look at a bill that I introduced on Syria, and I passed bills on Syria, putting sanctions on Syria, sanctions on Iran, both of which I had to compromise and water down the sanctions in order to get support from the other side. I did, but still we got sanctions in place. Less than I wanted to. In retrospect, we wouldn't probably be in this situation had we had the tougher sanctions. But the bottom line is we got something positive done. So the answer is, if you want to look at someone who is principled, who's a conservative, who's not going to change, put their finger in the wind, and can negotiate and work and build bridges to make things happen, there's really only one person in this race who has a track record of doing it. Nobody else does. None of the people who've ever been in Washington have any record of accomplishment. None. They're all relatively new senators, and they've been very good at screaming and hollering about how bad things are, but haven't stopped anything and haven't accomplished anything. And that, to me, is not, we don't need more of that in Washington. We don't need more people saying, I'm tough and I'm not going to do this, and I'm just going to, everything is bad, I'm going to vote against. We need folks who can figure out a way to get things done that's going to move the country forward. And if you want someone like that, I'm your man.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes, sir.
Do you think that we elect people who agree with what you're saying? First time they run for re-election, you don't even recognize them, and they get re-elected. So it's saying that you have to be elected in order to be able to do something.
Yeah, that's the famous line.
Yeah.
I can't do what you want me to do unless you elect me, and I can't get elected unless I, don't do what you want me to do.
Right.
And that's I know you've never had that situation here in Tennessee, but let me just say this. That's why I said what I said about Chuck Grassley. I represented Pennsylvania, not Tennessee. There are a few more Democrats in Pennsylvania than there are here in Tennessee. Like 1.5 million more Democrats and Republicans in my state. And I was able to win in that state twice in the United States Senate. And I had a 95% conservative voting record when I was in the United States Senate. And I was high profile on life issues,
partial birth abortion, born alive infant protection act, unborn victims, all these major bills that were passed, I was either the author of or the floor manager of. I stood out on national security issues in some respects to the right of George Bush and saying we had to get tougher. Not a very popular thing to do. I did welfare reform. And I was one of the authors of trying to reform the Social Security system in the second oldest state in the country. So it's not that I didn't take controversial positions, not that I didn't try to do big things. Is that a lot of people, I believe that, well, first, two things. I believe that most people don't expect you to agree with them on everything. What they expect is for you to believe what you say you believe, and that you're trustworthy and authentic in what you're trying to do. That you're trying to do what's best for the country. Not what's best for lobbyists, not what's best for the Republican Party, but what's best for the country. And people give you a lot of leeway if you do that. And I think that's the reason we were able to be successful. And secondly, I wasn't afraid to shake things up. I know a lot of people are talking now about how people have gone down there and tried to fight these things. When I came to the United States Congress in 1991, Republicans hadn't been in control of the Congress in 36 years. And I came there, and within a year, I was going after the two most powerful people in the House of Representatives. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the Speaker of the House. And I went to the floor of the House under criticism of my own party and went after them for what I saw was corruption in the House. And guess what? Within 3 years, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee was in jail and the Speaker of the House was defeated. Now, I caught a lot of heat. I caught a lot of pressure from my own party because they were all part of the old boy network there. But I never backed down because I knew it was right. But the difference is I got something done. If you look at welfare reform, I got something done. If you look at, anybody have a health savings account? You know what those are, health savings account? I was the author of health savings accounts. Every Republican candidate running for president is campaigning on health savings accounts because it's a way of getting the the people involved in healthcare, and getting the government out and you back in control of the healthcare system. I introduced that bill 22 years ago and fought for its inclusion and passage. So now millions and millions of Americans have health savings accounts, and it's really the only thing that's transforming this system. So look for someone who can stand up and is willing to fight and win. And that's who you're going to be able to trust. I know there are governors who have good records, and I think you know this, there are a lot of governors who look very conservative when they're governors, and then they go to the Senate, and they aren't that conservative after all. And the reason is when you're a governor, you have to be conservative because almost every state in the union requires you to balance your budget. And so you have to balance your budget. And there's limits as to how much you can do. Most of your money comes from the federal government. So it's a lot easier to be a conservative governor than it is to be a conservative senator when there's no requirement to balance anything. It's just who you want to please. And that's the problem. And that's why electing a governor, in my opinion, is a pig in a poke. They may be good, they may be not, you won't know. In my case, you know. Yes, sir.
Said you believe the Obergefell decision was an example of the court overstepping its constitutional authority. Do you also believe that the Loving v. Virginia case where the court legalized interracial marriage was an example of overstepping authority?
I think there's a fundamental difference between the Loving decision and the most recent decision. Marriage was still between a man and a woman. Marriage is marriage. This most recent decision said marriage is fundamentally transformed into something that has nothing to do with men and women. It has something to do with adults who want to be affirmed by society by having this equality. So Loving didn't change marriage. Marriage was still between a man and a woman. It's fundamental. Obergefell changed marriage into something fundamentally different. And they don't have the right to do that. What they had the right to do in Loving was to say that this was not
treating people equally under the law, and it wasn't. This has nothing to do with equality. This is a fundamental transformation of something that has existed for 5,000 years, and now we're redefining it into something that it never was. That is, the court can't do that, in my opinion. The court can't say that white is black just because the court says it's black. It is what it is. Marriage has been what it has been for 4,000 years in every civilization known to man. And there's a reason for it. And a court can't come in and say, okay, we're going to fundamentally change something. It's, you know, I've given these examples before, but you can't just take something like a light bulb and hold it up and say it's not a light bulb anymore. You know, it's a tire. Well, no. Light bulbs have certain characteristics or certain things, they mean certain things, and that's what it's defined as. That's what marriage is. And you can say, well, I don't think marriage should be that anymore. Fine, create something else if you want to create, but you can't redefine something that is what it is. And that's what the court, in my mind, did, not in my mind, in many people's minds, including 4 justices of the Supreme Court who dissented. And even the more important point, if you will, is the fact they have no constitutional authority to do it. What gives them the right in the Constitution to create something that they believe is best for society? That's not their job. Their job is to decide disputes between parties, not to fundamentally change the moral fabric of our country, which they did, and I think unjustly did. And by the way, if you take the logical consequence of loving, which is to allow interracial marriage was barred in some states, and that's unconstitutional. How does that change society? Marriage is still what it is. Society continues to go on. The only change is you might have more interracial couples and more interracial children. Basically the same. You change this, what's going to happen? Well, and let's say that all marriages, let's take the sort of the logical conclusion that all marriages would be interracial. Okay? So what would happen if the court's decision to change the definition of marriage actually ended up to the absurdum, right? To the absurd, that all marriages would be interracial. What impact would that have on society? None. We'd still have children, society would still go forward. We'd have interracial children instead of either black and white children. What would be the impact? Nothing substantial. Now let's take the absurdum argument that if the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision that all marriages would be gay marriages, what would happen? Society would end. There'd be no society. So, is that a good decision for society? I mean, is this something we want to encourage? Is this something we want to enshrine? I make the argument no. That because the logical conclusion, if all marriages turned into this, would be the end of civilization as we know it. Not a good thing, right? So you say, well, that's an absurd argument. Yeah, but you have to sort of follow the argument as to what we're trying to promote. Because in fact, what they're promoting is that very thing. That this is a good for society. If it's a good for society, why is it then if we apply it everywhere, then it should be a good for society? No, it's not. So then you have to question, well, maybe it isn't good for society. But we haven't done that. We haven't had that discussion. We're not allowed to have that discussion. But it's a discussion we need to have as to whether something is a fundamental good or not. Yes? I'm sorry, yes, ma'am.
As a woman voting in my first presidency, I would like to know how you feel that your presidency would benefit women in this nation.
I would make the argument that I'm not running for president for any one group of people or another. I think we do too much in America to divide people up into groups and classes and genders and age groups and everything else, and say, I'm going to do this for you or I'm going to do this for you. A president should focus on what's best for America. And if we do what's best for America, what's going to be best for women, it's going to be best for men, it's going to be best for everybody. I know this is that we've gotten into this rut and Republicans have joined, and I think it's a mistake. The Democratic Party exists today because of special interests. That's what they are. They focus in on different groups of people and they try to maximize their vote in those areas, and they don't really care about America generally. So when you see the President of the United States do what he's done on the issue of race, there's a reason for that.
because he wants to make sure that he continues and his party continues to get 90+% of the African American vote. That's what it's about. Why is the administration taken the position, or Democrats in the last few years, 10, 12 years, of almost unlimited immigration from Central and South America? You think it's because they believe that's good for American workers? No. Why? Because they want to win Hispanic votes. And they believe that if there's 4 open borders from that area of the world, they can point to Republicans and conservatives and say they're anti-Hispanic, and thereby galvanize more of that vote, which they believe is the ascending vote and a ticket for them to be able to be successful elected. You talk about women. Anybody know what percentage of the vote Mitt Romney got of women? What was the percentage of the women vote? He got like low 40s, right? Like 43, I think, percent, 44%. He didn't do very well. What percentage of the vote did he get of married women? 62%. So when people say, well, Republicans have a problem with women, we have a problem with single women, not married women. And so if you look at the policies of the Democratic Party, what is the policy of the Democratic Party? They're all oriented towards single women. All of them. Whether it's their welfare policy, whether it's their social policy, it's all oriented toward appealing to single women and trying to drive up that number. And of course now with marriage rates, particularly among lower and middle income people, going down, in part because of the policies of the left, they have a wonderful synergy working, where their votes are coming more from single women and their policies create more single women long-term in America, which creates a much more stable voting base for them. Works out really beautifully. So the reason you're asking this question is because that's how they see the world. They see the world politically with blocks of votes and issues as to how to appeal to those blocks of vote that they need to win. And whether having unlimited number of immigrants has a positive impact or negative impact on Americans overall, who cares? I'm going to win with the policies that I'm promoting. And that's why I think segmenting society the way that the left does is incredibly damaging. And having a president will go out and talk about what we're going to do to help Americans. Immigration's a great example. When you hear the word immigration, or you think about the immigration issue, what person pops in your mind? Not famous person, but what individual is at the heart of the immigration issue in America? What pops into your mind? Come on, be honest. When I say the immigration issue, who do you visualize as being the center of the discussion on the immigration issue? No, I'm not talking about a president. I'm talking about what person, if you were thinking about an American, sort of the average American, what pops into your mind when you think about the issue of immigration?
American worker that's not working.
How about you? Is that what pops into your mind, an American worker that's not working? I can tell you that's not what pops in most people's minds.
Hispanics.
Yeah, Hispanic, a Mexican, who's what?
Latinos.
Who's what?
Illegal.
Illegal. Now, come on, let's be honest. Let's be honest. How many, when you hear the word immigration or immigration reform, does the image of a Mexican who is illegal pop into your mind? Raise your hand. Okay, all of you. Who did that? They did. Now, let me ask you this question. When you think of the word healthcare, what do you think about? Well, okay, I'm not, again, get rid of the politicians. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about who do you think about who's affected by?
Low income, welfare.
Okay, right. When you think about, when you think about any other issue in America, who do you think about? You think about how it affects Americans, except immigration. They've convinced you that immigration shouldn't be about what's in the best interest for America. It should be what's in the best interest for this illegal immigrant that's here and what are we going to do with him? Because that's the entire discussion. They've convinced you that there's one area of the law that's different than every other area of the law. Because if you were going to say what tax policy should you have, what agriculture policy you have, you would say, well, we should have an agricultural policy that's in the best interest of Americans, right? We should have a tax policy that's in the best interest of Americans. We should have an immigration policy in the best interest of the illegal immigrant that's in this country. Okay? But that's the debate, and Republicans have bought into this. I haven't. I know there's somebody out there who's getting a lot of voice on this issue of immigration. But I introduced an immigration plan 7 months ago. And I did so, and here's what I said. Here are the facts, ladies and gentlemen. Over the last 20 years, 35 million people have come into this country, legally and illegally combined. Now you can say that's a good thing or a bad thing. It could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. But that's the fact. It's the highest number ever in the history of our country. Never anymore. What's that?
Are any of them working?
I'll get through the numbers. We have the highest percentage of people living in this country who were born here in 105 years. That could be a good thing. That could be a bad thing. Now, the percentage of people who are in this country legally and illegally over the last 20 years, what percentage of those folks are lower skilled workers? Lower to unskilled workers? Anywhere, depending on who you believe, 70 to 90%. I suspect it's closer to 90. But 79% are unskilled workers, which means if they do go to work, what kind of jobs are they going to take? Wage jobs, right? They're going to be wage earners, right? So, here's the logical question. How does immigration impact the folks who are most impacted by immigration, which are wage earners in America? Would you think that's a fair question to ask as to whether immigration has served the best interest of our country? All right? Now let's look at some more facts. In the last 25 years, wages have gone up less than a nickel an hour per year. We've had the lowest wage growth in the history of our country. Last quarter was the lowest wage growth ever recorded in the history of our country. And we had 1.7 million new immigrants come into this country, million legally, 700,000 illegally. Jobs. Since 2000, between 2000 and 2014, there were 5.7 million new jobs created in America. What percentage of those net new jobs, the new jobs created, are held by people who weren't born here? All of them. There are fewer native-born Americans working today than there was in the year 2000, but there's 17 million more native-born Americans net in the workforce. So, if you were going to take a step back and say, given those numbers, and there's a lot of others, would you say that the immigration system we have, has been positive for American workers? I think most people would say it probably hasn't been. Now, I would suspect if you went out there and you laid this out to the American public, in maybe not as controversial a way as some other candidates are doing, that you could actually have a debate about what kind of immigration system we're going to have based on what is in the best interest of American and American workers. But that's not what we're doing. That's what I'm doing. And I go on MSNBC, I go on Bill Maher, I go on Rachel Maddow, I go on all those shows. And I talk about this issue because there are voters out there on the other side, not just Republicans, who will see this and say, wait a minute, maybe we need to think again about what our immigration policy is. This woman over there asked, how are you going to bring people together? You bring people together by using common sense and appealing to what makes sense in the best interest of our country. And that's what I'm going to do. I'll take, how much time have I got? One more?
One more question, Rick.
Okay. I want to, before you get out of here, I want to thank Sonny and Sally Clymer for putting this together, and they put a great day together for us here in West Tennessee. And if I had like 10 more of them, I'd be unstoppable in the country. So can you give Sally and Sonny a big round of applause? Okay, one more question. You?
Anchor babies.
Okay, anchor babies. Look, the issue, he just said anchor babies, I'm repeating this question. The answer is, the United States Constitution is very clear. It says, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution says, anybody born in the United States of America and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a citizen. So, people who say, well, if you're born in America, you're automatically a citizen because the Constitution says it. Well, the Constitution just doesn't say that. It says, yes, if you're born here, but it also says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Who determines whether you're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States of America? Well, we have laws, right? That are in place that determine whether you're in, who passes those laws? Who has the right to pass laws on immigration?
Congress.
The Congress. So, is it illogical to say that the Congress ultimately should determine whether someone who's here illegally and has a child is legitimately, is their child is a citizen or not? At the time the amendment was passed, Native Americans were not considered citizens. They were born here. They're certainly subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. If they were off the reservation and they committed a crime, they had to deal with the legal system in America. There are diplomats who have children here, and they say, well, they're not subject to the... Well, but all those decisions were made by Congress. And I would make the argument that Congress has the right, in fact, the obligation, to make this decision as to whether children born here to illegal immigrants or came here or born on, it's not a huge problem, but it is a problem. People coming in this country to have children and then going back home, and so they can come later on. Those are all issues that Congress needs to deal with. And so my opinion is that anybody born up till now is a United States citizen. Why? Because that's the way the law has been interpreted for a long time, and they have their citizenship, and I'm not going to go and take people's citizenship away. But going forward, I think the Congress can pass a law and say what are the boundaries of citizenship for people who are born here. And not everybody is included today, and not everybody, in my opinion, should be included. And I take the position that if you're here illegally, then your children should not be considered citizens of this country. I just don't think that's there's only one other country in the world that allows that, and that's Canada. And so the idea that we're somehow being discriminatory, I think, is wrong. What we're doing is encouraging people to come to this country illegally. And we have all sorts of things. I don't blame the people that come here. I blame the government that encourages people to break the law to come here. And that's what we're doing. With that, let me thank you all very much. And let me just I can't leave a crowd without asking for your support. So I would very much appreciate your vote. I know there's a little bag in the back that you might, if you want to put some tangible support in there, we'd be very, very grateful for that tangible support, a volunteer card or a contribution. This is a lot of people in this race, so a lot of competition for resources, and we would certainly appreciate anything you can do to help us here. And of course, finally, appreciate your prayers. This is a battle out there. When you're out there talking about the controversial issues, as you heard me talk about, a lot of people aren't very friendly on those subject matters. And so please pray for me and for my family, and frankly, pray for everybody who's running for office and their families. It's a brutal grind out there, and we need that prayerful support to keep us going. Thank you all very much, and God bless.
We have a small appreciation token here. We want to give Senator Santorum. This is from the Old Country Store where you are. And we'll get Sally or Sonny one to take it for you, because I know before you leave you want to shake a lot of hands. Thank you very much for coming. God bless you. We will be praying for you, okay? And I know we have some media over here that wants to holler at you just 2 minutes before you leave. And I think the son is here too. God bless y'all. Come on up and meet the senator if you got time. Thank you for coming.